Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of the Nation's Weekly Podcast. Joseph Carlson here, editor-in-chief, and I get to be the host of today's conversation with, if you've been watching along, a familiar face. Stephen Elliott actually was the very first podcast interview that we did years ago when we launched the first iteration, scare quotes, of the Nation's Pod, which has now become the Nation's Presents. It's a long-form series. Your guys' conversation was 2 hours.
It was long.
So impressive there.
Yeah.
But if you haven't seen that and you're one of our paying subscribers, you can go to our video archive. There's a series of wonderful conversations with different reformers that we featured. But today, we're going to dive back into Stephen's life and story a little bit, but we're going to kind of come at it from a little bit of a different angle. The conversation that Joel and Stephen initially had was centered around a book that Stephen wrote recounting his own story. It's called War Story. I recommend it. It's a good read. And, well, the first half is a good read. Got to be honest here. I haven't finished it yet, but the first half is great. And you're a better writer. You know, maybe you can write for us someday.
Oh, wow. Thank you.
It's good to have goals. Now, but there's so much, man, I've gotten to know you and learn from you as we've been running this experiment, which is this new version of Nations. I thought it'd be great for us to just sit down and have a conversation, unpack some of the things that you're passionate about, because a big part of how you see the world and what you're passionate about is shaping and informing what we do here at Nations. I mean, not only do you have the privilege and the heavy burden of being our business leader, and helping make sure that we do things like budgets and have goals and whatnot. But yeah, you're a deep well, you're a deep thinker, and your journey is a rich one. So I kind of would love to explore this conversation over the course of 3 sort of movements or chapters, and that's formation, fallout, and then the way forward. So for the people who have never heard of you before, who haven't read your book or didn't listen to that initial podcast, this first sort of section, formation, I'm kind of curious. I'm curious to know about some of, the biographical details about where you're from, kind of how did you end up in the chair opposite me? But I'm more so interested in what were the kind of powerful shaping forces that have resulted in who Stephen is today. You were born in, I know, 2 I'm particularly curious about, and you're free to explore other ones. But you were born into a spiritual tradition.
Yes.
And that religious practice is an incredibly powerful formative force. And then you went through the military, which is also this insane formation engine. I mean, they are teaching you to become to march in formation. So I'd love for you to just share some of your story through that lens of formation and how those different forces have kind of shaped you.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think it's really, I appreciate the framing with respect to that. I grew up, I was an only child. I grew up in central Kansas. My mom and my dad, they actually separated and divorced shortly after I was born. And so I was kind of the first and only child of their union. And all of my family, both my mom and my dad's side, attended. My granddads were wheat and cattle farmers. So, and they both attended, and my folks grew up attending the same small, very conservative Lutheran church in central Kansas. And so that was the faith tradition of both sides of the family. And then after they were divorced, when I was an infant, my mom left the Lutheran church, which was a pretty big deal. And because the way that the family sort of viewed it was, and this was pretty explicitly put to her at one point, was the fact that the way that you honor your parents is by maintaining the faith tradition. And I say that like both sets of my grandparents it was a much more buttoned down perhaps version of the faith, but very much authentic in terms of the way that they pursued that and expressed that. So that was part of the heritage. But for her, so this is early 1980s. So the still sort of the momentum of sort of the Jesus movement was there. I don't know how long it took to get from California to Kansas, but a while apparently. And so she was going to Assemblies of God churches and all manner of churches where like things were happening. You know, there were like, these were the places where like being quote unquote slain in the spirit or like spiritual healings, those sorts of things were occurring. Not all the time, but she had, you know, a radical encounter with Jesus, and then she was, in her own way, she was just going wherever she could to try and find that. And so that was sort of the tradition. That was the world that I showed up in spiritually, was in the small town of Central Kansas with a single mom who, by the way, is also still is to this day a senior sales director in Mary Kay Cosmetics. And so I was the kid being dropped off as far away from soccer practice as I could in the only pink car for miles.
Oh,
and
that's great.
So it was mortifying.
Target on your back.
Yeah, 100%, very much so. But she's an amazing lady, still is to this day. And her, you know, her prayer for me and very express, you know, wish for me was that I would follow whatever the Lord put on my heart. And so she was very, very open with respect to that. And it was interesting because growing up, I would, you know, in some cases we'd be going to, you know, all manner of evangelical, you know, Christian gatherings and churches. And then I would visit my grandparents, and it would be a very, very conservative Lutheran gathering in this, you know, this small Midwestern town. And so I grew up in the church for all intents and purposes, and grew up probably around a more charismatic side of the church. And didn't have a dad in my life. My grandfather, my mom's dad, was the closest thing to a dad that I had, and he was a farmer, but he was also a veteran of World War II, and so he had served for a year and a half in the Italian campaign. And as a kid, I mean, I played with my share of GI Joes, and you know, could turn any stick into a gun, you know, kind of thing. And so that was always idealized in my mind in terms of the idea of military service. And so his influence in my life was very formational, just in terms of not pushing military service, but in terms of setting this example of this generation of people who laid down their lives in terms of their daily lives, went, volunteered, fought the Axis powers, and then came home. And so, yeah, I guess my formation was very much in the church. It was very much with the family of faith. And
was that,
yeah.
Okay, so if I'm hearing you correctly, you've got this interesting tension, because you've got, as you mentioned, on the one hand, kind of the conservative button-down Lutheran tradition, which has an emphasis on liturgy and on a much clearer in-group, out-group sort of, you know, binary. And then you have, the strange emergent spiritual movement that was birthed out of the Jesus movement. And as you said, your mom discovers a more personal and experiential form of it. So I'm curious, what was your, like, when you think back on that, was faith and religious practice like a positive thing? Did you thrill to that? Or were you resistant to it?
It's a good question. My mom would tell a story like that. I was 4 years old in a car when I told her that I wanted to follow Jesus. And her response was, then you should tell him that. And so I was very much alive in that way, engaged, like my awareness as a child and my interest as a child in God, the Bible, all of that was very much there. And then from a family standpoint, by the time I was old enough to kind of know what was going on, a lot of the tension had been resolved. But when I was very young, like, my grandparents thought she was in a cult, like, straight up, you know? And so there was a lot of concern for her well-being, both in terms of just the fact of, like, she's gone through a divorce, she's now a single mom running a business, et cetera, but also just culturally, you know, you go to, which I have a lot of appreciation for what that must have been like for my grandparents to be, they're children of the Depression. This is the service, and this is the cultural expression of their faith as a community that they've had for their entire lives. And then they're going to, they actually visited, one of the Assemblies of God churches that we went to as an infant, and I think it terrified them. And so there was a bit of, like, tension. I remember as a kid where, like, this idea of what was spiritually alive versus spiritually dead, I think to some degree took on a bit of a form of being applied to certain Christian denominations, which I don't believe is necessarily true, but I think that was just within the context of that cultural experience within our own family.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to me. I think that I'm sure this will come back up later in the conversation, but yeah, even from an early age, you're exposed to different legitimate expressions of following Jesus.
Yeah.
And you mentioned your grandfather being the primary like male figure. It sounds like he kind of provided you with a vision of what it looks like to be a man. And yeah. What was your relationship like with your mom? Was it good growing up?
Yeah, it was really good. I mean, it was, she was always very supportive of whatever I wanted to do in terms of like activities, sports, et cetera. And the fact that she was kind of a small business owner helped a lot. So she actually, she was really a pioneer in a lot of ways in terms of what she was doing and how she was living her life. She was entrepreneurial, and yeah, she was a great mom, you know, in so many ways, and still is. So I'm really, really, really grateful for her.
That sounds amazing. So you've got, on one hand, an example of strength and entrepreneurial spirit from your mom, but also religious and spiritual vitality. That sounds like she mainly just was encouraging you to discover who it was that you are, to explore freedom. And then you've got the vision of your grandfather and the history of military service there. So obviously, so then let's move towards how was for you. I mean, I know you went to Oral Roberts University.
I did.
Was that a very formational experience for you?
Oh boy.
Yeah.
That's a podcast series. Yeah, ORU was amazing. It was an incredibly positive experience. I did not plan on going to ORU. I was accepted. My plan was, I was accepted at University of Kansas. I was going to go to law school after studying political science. I had actually, I don't know if I should say this in public, but I had actually gone to a University of Kansas law camp. So that
I've been to way more. No, I've been to way more embarrassing camps than you, dude.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah, I went to geology camp. That's one of them.
Wow.
One of the camps that I went to.
Wow. Yeah. So that was so many questions, but
no. This is about you. All right. So you plan to go to state, and then instead you end up at ORU.
End up at ORU, and it was like I had Tulsa, which is where Oral Roberts University was and still is the headquarters of many, many charismatic ministries. And so a lot of the quote unquote content that my mom was exposed to, or like the strains of charismatic Christianity that maybe she was influenced by in some form or fashion, a lot of them were in and around Tulsa. So we had visited Tulsa, I remember when I was a kid. And if any of our listeners ever are in and around Tulsa, it's an amazing town, great city. Please go and visit the campus of Oral Roberts University because it looks like the Jetsons came and planted a space colony in the year 1965.
No way.
Like the architecture and the vision that was given to Oral, who was this, basically healing evangelist with no college degree. And the Lord gave him this vision to plant a university in South Tulsa to raise up students to go into not just train ministers, but to basically, we need doctors and lawyers and teachers and nurses and geologists, and we need all of these people who are filled with the Holy Spirit going into the world. And that was really the vision of the school. And I knew when I visited there as a surly 18-year-old, I was angry because there's no brick and ivy. There's like some of the buildings have like, it's like gravel glued to the walls like that. You know what I mean? And it's cool. It's actually pretty cool today to see that. But it was like, I knew that's where I needed to be. And that was not the plan that I had initially formulated. But at ORU, kind of the condensed version of that, I studied business. And it was at a time when the university itself was in a very strained time because there was kind of two schools. There was the very unhealthy name it and claim it prosperity gospel sort of front that was being like pretty shamelessly presented to students at chapel services in ways that, like, to even describe to you some of the services, not all of them, there's many that were really wonderful, but some of them, it sounds made up. Some of the things that would have been said from the pulpit. And so you had that happening, but then you had this huge cadre of teachers, administrators, other leaders they represented a pretty wide swath of Christendom. The chair of the theology department at the time was Roman Catholic. And you had these people who were like, in some cases, they'd been teaching there for 30 or 40 years, and they were really invested, and they were sort of holding the line of, like, I know what you just heard. Like, you just, like you could see the shock and awe going into a business law class of people who were just like, what did we just hear in chapel?
Right.
And like the grace that a lot of those professors had to like speak truth when it was needed, but also not undermine leadership was pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So I had a very rich experience there, but also that was rich because it was relationally rich. Like I could separate a lot of the some of the theology that was presented and from the actual authentic relationships that I was experiencing. But I would say that the final thing I would say kind of on that piece was that I was a quote unquote good kid. I was, in retrospect, like going into that time of young adulthood, I was an RA and I was leading mission teams and I was, good business student. And so unwittingly, I was sort of becoming the older son in the story of the two sons, right? Luke 15, right? Yeah. Where you essentially believe without ever writing that down or telling anybody that, you essentially believe that you're actually pretty good, in that you have a seat at the Father's table because of the fact that you're pretty good. And the tragic irony of that is you don't realize the extent to which that's true until that's challenged. And so that was really, and that's, I don't blame that on anybody. It's not like I got a bad exegesis on a passage and that was my theology. I was filtering that through my own pride, my own experience, and really just my own youth.
Yeah. I appreciate the you taking responsibility there, but at the same time, some of that is the force of formation at work, right? Like, hey, there is a cultural expression and expectation about what a good Christian boy or burgeoning man from Oral Roberts University looks like, and baked into the vision and values of the institution, and
which was very much, which is a fair point, because the point of that university, which is one of the things that was attractive to it, is it's educating the whole person, spirit, mind, and body, which is great. But you do have, and I don't know what that's like now, but I don't think it's strictly endemic to ORU, but that environment definitely lends itself to unintentionally, I think, a works-based sort of presentation, where it's just like, well, wait a second, you're not experiencing life and vitality in all parts of your life. Well, what are you doing wrong? Right? So, I mean, have you not been to Devos like 5 times this week? Right? Are you not, like, what's happening here? So let's target that so we can, make sure, which there's an element of like, obviously living by biblical principles, it can bring life and vitality. But the quote unquote, the theology of suffering was essentially, you're doing it wrong.
Which is interesting because, the next chapter, you move into the military, which suffering is baked into their formation. Last fun question before we move to that. It's safe to say then, you being the good boy that you were, and the elder son, so you never claimed to be tardy to class because you were slain in the spirit in chapel?
No, but I really wish that never happened at ORU, but it 100% did at times. Yeah. I had as a side, I had a lot of great professors, and like any school, like you've got some that, it's just like, well, that's like a refund on that class. But it was like a after lunch humanity, it was like an after chapel humanities class. And God bless her, that teacher, she just, like, there's so many times after, like, she was still in the afterglow of whatever happened in chapel. And it's just like, we were going to talk about Greek architecture, but doggone it, I feel like there's some folks here that we need to pray for. I'm just like, no, there aren't. Like, unless somebody is bleeding.
There are in the chapel.
There are in the chapel, but I'm here for an education, please.
Yeah.
And so there was some of that, but it was a I mean, the people that I got to meet and the relationships that I still have to this day are priceless. And that was an amazing experience.
So you mentioned before you ended up at ORU, and you said you got a degree in business?
Yes.
Okay. That you had planned on state and you wanted to become a lawyer.
Yeah.
So when did the turn in the fork in the road come where you ended up in the military?
That came, 9/11. So that was my junior year of college. And I still remember that day pretty clearly. And as everyone kind of has their own, 9/11, story in terms of how they found out and all of that. And it really got the wheels turning for me in terms of, I think that's when, because I never ever seriously considered military service as I, became a teenager. It was just like, yeah, I played Army like a lot of kids, but I don't want to do that. And then when that happened, I think that's when I can look back now and I can see that two stories in particular really influenced me. One was the story of my grandfather. So all of a sudden we have a Pearl Harbor-like event that is happening at the time when I'm almost exactly the same age that he was when he volunteered and joined the military as a result of Pearl Harbor. And so part of that question of what are you going to do in terms of, partaking in this struggle, whatever that would even look like, who knows what that looks like, against those that attacked our country. And so that weighed on me really heavily as far as like, it felt like between me and whatever I would do as a young adult, like, it's just like, I don't know if I could live with myself if I didn't join the military. And I didn't export that onto other people. Like, it wasn't just like, it was just, I felt that for me. I didn't feel like, well, everyone needs to join or do that. It was just a burden that I was increasingly feeling and really stewing on and like, wrestling with. And then, interestingly, and I didn't realize this, honestly, sometimes I think the forces that shape us the most powerfully it takes us a while to see them because they're so ingrained. And so 9/11 happens, obviously, November of 2001. December of 2001, probably one of the most impactful films that I've ever seen was released in theaters called Black Hawk Down.
Oh, yeah.
And Black Hawk Down it's an amazing film. As many listeners will know, it tells the story of Delta 160th helicopter pilots and Army Rangers in combat in Mogadishu. And watching that film and seeing particularly those communities highlighted, it was just like, I mean, you couldn't have had a better recruiting film for special operations at that time. And obviously Ridley Scott, the director, did not mean that to be the case. They were telling a true story based on a book that had been written years before. But that really, then you had this like historical story of, grandfather in World War II. Then that just gets further contextualized as to what that could look like for me in terms of really service, sure, but also kind of a self-imposed rite of passage. Kind of a self-imposed, like, if I just, wear a tie and, run spreadsheets and live in the business world, am I really a man? Right? And so, like, this whole thing, there's a lot of things wrapped into that in terms of not all altruistic with respect to, can I do that?
Sure.
Adventure, challenge, all of these things. And then all of a sudden there's sort of oh wow, like maybe that community or some element of that community is something that I want to pursue. So then that sort of sent me down a path of, reading every book I could get my hands on special operations and all these different communities. And then ultimately deciding like, yep, I'm enlisting in the military, and then enlisting specifically to go through Ranger selection. And so that's what happened. I graduated with my bachelor's degree in business, and then 3 weeks later, I was beginning that military journey.
It's interesting. Stories are always being presented to us, whether that's being done explicitly or intentionally or not. And yeah, you invoking, obviously, 9/11 is, it's an inflection point in our country's history. And man, the amount of stories that were spawned out of that event are, I mean, they're manifold, and I think that the implications and impacts of those stories is still unfolding in our country. But so I see this at one of its most base levels. It's a story of threat, and that to me is interesting because it does, any threat to us as individuals elicits an immediate subconscious response, and fight, flight, freeze. But that's happening for you like receive or hear that story in the particular context that you're talking about, which is at Oral Roberts, which is a conservative Christian institution, evangelical, in the geographic region. And I mean, I don't want to mischaracterize, so feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but I grew up in Seattle, which is progressive and pretty non-churched, but there's an interesting, the military, national pride, that sense of service, of courage. There's a bunch of different stories that are all swirling about this young Stephen that I see. And so I find it hard to imagine you responding in a different sort of way. It's priming at you to say like, hey, will you take the leap? But
yeah. It probably in some respects it would have been harder not to, given some of the influence and just all of everything that was in those cultural waters as well.
Which is interesting too, because we don't, as a culture and as a faith tradition as well, we don't do, like male formation happens differently than female formation does on a number of different levels. And we don't do a particularly good job at initiating boys into manhood in our culture.
No, I mean, what happened, it's kind of one of those things, like you're going to be initiated into something. It's a question of what and how.
Yeah.
And so like identity, you have an identity. You will like seek identity. You will fill that vacuum with something. And so I think that there's media has done a lot of that heavy lifting for us in all sorts of forms where we, without even knowing it, right? We're swimming in stories in some form or fashion, from which you can't engage with any story, whether it's a book or film or binge watch TV show, and not allow some component of that narrative to become a part of you. Because if it's so offensive to you then you just turn it off. But if I'm engaging with the content, I'm engaging with something. I'm identifying with something. Even if it's just one character or even if it's just one aspect of it, it becomes part of you. And so I think that, even reflecting on that, like Black Hawk Down, it's an amazing film. The story is an incredible story. And at the same time, the film is not true. I think we get, and especially I'll talk about like war films in particular, because I have just a little bit of experience in terms of like being on the audience side, and at least in a very narrow set, the participant side, is there is no war film that is true. You're taking events that may be true in the case of Black Hawk Down, and you're putting them in the hands of one of the most brilliant cinematographers and directors that is Ridley Scott. And you're putting them in the hands of one of the most brilliant, musicians, and I think Hans Zimmer. And you're giving it to artists to do what they do, which is good, to essentially make this god-awful thing watchable.
Yeah.
That's what they do. And so and then what you see, you don't smell it, you don't feel it, you're not personally related to these people that are getting torn apart. You're just sitting there eating popcorn. And you see the elements of war that are beautiful, which are self-sacrifice. It's camaraderie. It's purpose, right? It's these things that get presented that are really virtuous and that do exist and can exist within a military context, but certainly not exclusively there. And so you see that, you're entertained, and then that becomes, you feel as though you know more than you actually do about that thing. And that was, in reflection, that was kind of my experience with respect to that.
Yeah. Well, especially, isn't that the power of story in so many ways? A good artist does transport us there, invites us into that reality. But you're right. We have to be discerning and realize, pick a cliche, Lord of the Rings, love it. I mean, it's a all-time story. Read a great tweet last week that criticized its writing. And I think we talked about it actually. Yeah. We're like, actually, great storyteller, maybe not the best writer all the time. But as much as I can go and inhabit the world of Middle Earth and learn about it and know about it, I can't actually go there. And I've still never been in some ways. So it can cultivate certain virtues in us and certain like healthy responses. It can develop empathy. Yeah. It can increase knowledge and understanding. But you're right. Ultimately, there's a limit there. I had a great question come to mind. I want it to come back to me. This is great where we have the producer here who's also the editor, so he can always edit out this section. Yeah, or we could choose to leave it in. Authenticity. Okay. So there's limits to what a film like Black Hawk Down can do, and it sets us up in some ways to misunderstand the realities and the complexities of something like the war experience, but does show some of the beautiful sides to it. One thing that's interesting to me is that so the film experience there, and even as you mentioned earlier, your experience at Oral Roberts, it was perhaps unbalanced because neither of them do a really good job at equipping you with a robust theology of suffering and an understanding that about some of the savagery and pain of life and of war and the impact that it has on shaping and forming us, and even the ways that God can be present in and work through that. So I'm kind of interested to go there at some point, but is there anything you want to share about your experience in the military, in the process of going through that? I mean, we don't need to get into the particulars of what does it look like to go to, to become an Army Ranger, but, you go through that training and you go on deployment and you experience I'd say the beauty and the dark side of both of those. So could you just speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. So I think in general, now, especially after 20 years, there's all manner of resources written by all manner of people, including myself to some degree. Like I've written my own story, so I'm not ragging on veterans who've told their story because I'm one of them. But yeah, if you want to know what it's like to go through Ranger selection, you can find that out. Yeah. It is, in general, it trains you and it self-selects for people who are basically willing to put up with pain, because that's really the distinguishing characteristic, is you don't have to be the most athletic, although there's a certain amount of physical requirement. It really is just, will you quit? And so that's understandable. The downside of that is it doesn't give you a great toolbox to draw on to the extent that you're perhaps suffering in other ways post-deployment, post-war, because you've been conditioned within an environment that says, to ask for help is weakness, right? And so that's, I think that's part of it. And you also have a lot of people who, at least in my experience, especially within Army infantry, and then going into that culture, I don't know the percentage, purely anecdotal. I don't speak for anybody but myself in terms of military veteran community, but you have a lot of people who are like myself who have their own version of father wounds. And for them, in some cases, the military is the first, and like a drill sergeant or a Ranger cadre is like the closest thing to a male role model that they've had. And somebody, not treating them particularly politely with respect to their performance is like a weird form of love, because it's like somebody cares enough about me to yell at me. So there's a lot of challenges with that in terms of just the emotional challenges and spiritual challenges that come with it, but also I think sometimes what people are set up for in terms of some element of failure with respect to that. Not to mention the fact that you're going into an environment that offers you this incredible identity, like in my case, like being an Army Ranger, like that's amazing, and an incredibly fickle identity, because even if you're successful, whatever that means, at some point that will end. At some point you won't be that anymore. And so then what? Then who are you? And so there's a lot of there's a lot of those things that are baked into it. But my experience, specifically, I showed up at 2nd Ranger Battalion in Fort Lewis, Washington, which is what took me to the Pacific Northwest, which was great. I was on track. I have a plan. God's job is to kind of underwrite my plan, more or less. And so,
sign of his favor is that your plan is working.
And so arrived at 2nd Ranger Battalion, trained there for a number of months. And then, we deployed, this was, relatively early on in the War on Terror. So the battalion had just gone on their first Afghan deployment. In fact, when I got there, guys were mourning the very first KIA from 2nd Battalion at the time. Had just happened.
Wow.
And so it was all in hindsight, it just seems like so much has happened in 20 years. That was right at the beginning of it. But we were deployed, our company was deployed to the Afghan-Pakistan border in the spring of 2004 as part of a spring surge. Mountain passes open. And so, fighters move about more freely. And the long and short of the experience was through the course of a lot of mistakes in terms of command and control and what our unit was asked to do, and our unit was split, et cetera. Our part of the platoon found itself on the receiving end of an ambush. And so we were responding to that. And then the other part of the platoon that we did not know where it was, those guys had gone off to accomplish another objective. They responded to that ambush, and they positioned themselves on a ridgeline that we did not know they were there. And so as we came out of a canyon, having been fired upon for some number of minutes, we see muzzle flashes, and superiors on my vehicle respond to that and shoot. I shoot as well, my weapon. And when the smoke clears and we figure out what's happened, we realize that we'd sustained 4 casualties, 2 dead and 2 wounded. And then very quickly, we knew immediately that all of those were as a result of friendly fire. Yeah. And so we go back to the FOB for operating base, and there's debriefs and there's investigations, and we're told, tell the truth, right? You're not in trouble, but just as best you can, tell what happened and what you saw, et cetera. And so we did that, and then we went back. We were in the FOB for maybe a week. It was a pretty tense debrief because half the platoon was getting shot at, and the other, at least some of the guys, were doing some of the shooting. But they tried to get us back on our horse as quickly as possible, and we were out, doing more missions as a platoon. And then when we came home, we discovered that the narrative that we had told in terms of when we were asked what happened, and we all knew it was friendly fire, and we didn't, there wasn't any deception around that in terms of our platoon. We found that a very different narrative had been told about the deaths of one of our comrades to the American public. And so, and that individual was a professional athlete who was a wonderful guy to serve with. And he was one of the guys who died that day. And so at that point, it was the element of friendly fire, which was not in Black Hawk Down. That's not a narrative that people talk about or want to talk about for kind of obvious reasons in terms of the guilt and shame that can accompany that. And then it was the element of some element of a media frenzy around who had been killed, and then around the level of deception as far as what had happened. And so that was my wartime experience.
Jeez. Well, I'm very sorry that was your experience, man. It's tragic on so many different levels and frustrating and infuriating. I'm curious, like I said, if people want to learn more about that and your recollection and experience of that, then they can go read your book or listen to our longer podcast. And I'm kind of interested more so not in those events and the drama surrounding it, but kind of to understand then the impact, right? We're kind of looking at this conversation through this lens of formation and these forces, spiritual and otherwise, that have shaped you and who you are. And so in all of that, how does that end up impacting your mind, your heart, your view of yourself, God? I mean, there's a story, like you said, that was the driving force behind your life up until that point. And it surely didn't include an experience like that. I mean, you prepare to go to war and you prepare to do what it is that you were trained to do. But I'm sure you never had any drills that prepared you for an experience like that. So what was, most disorienting or harmful or wounding about that sort of experience?
Yeah, I think it was, again, to kind of go back to use that word picture, I went, as the shock wore off, I went from being the older son in the story to the younger son in the story. And basically, like, I can remember, like, there was still muscle memory left with respect to spiritual practices. Like, okay, I'll go to a church gathering, when, and I remember doing that, and it just increasingly, like, it was like each time I would go, it made less and less sense why I was there. I was just like, I don't know what is this? Like, why am I here? And then I remember one time I got reassigned from Fort Lewis to the East Coast, and I was at Columbia, South Carolina, and I went to the big Baptist church on the corner for a Sunday morning gathering, and I guess people picked me out of the crowd pretty quickly as being military. I had did not have facial hair and had a bad haircut, so I guess that kind of tips people off. I was there by myself, and I just remember, like, and you're in South Carolina as well, which that's like a whole nother level of hospitality, and just beautiful people. But I just remember, like, people, like people wanting to like introducing themselves. Can we take you out to lunch? And thank you for your service and all this stuff. And it's just like thank me for my service. Like, do you know? Like, I just got fired from being a ranger for, like, potentially shooting somebody that was on the cover of Sports Illustrated. So, and you want to go have lunch? Like, I gotta get out of here.
Yeah.
And so then it was sort of like the whole, well, how do I have any level of community when kind of the biggest deal going on in my life right now is this giant, like, unresolved thing? There were still investigations going on. And then you have, like, post-traumatic stress starting to set in, where I'm beginning to medicate with alcohol just to sleep. And so then you're in a position where it's just like, well, if I'm going to be around people, either the conversations we have are going to be pretty depressing and I'm not going to be great company right now, or I'm just going to have to lie. And I just rather not do that.
Yeah.
And so isolating more and more. And then in that isolation, which was easy to do given on the job that I had met Brooke, who's my wife at that time, and we were dating and we got married during that season. And she's very much part of the fallout that I experienced is also fallout that she experienced and had to walk through with me.
Yeah.
And so in many respects at this point, the story becomes just as much hers and our eldest daughter as it is mine, in terms of their own secondary and tertiary woundedness with respect to what I was dealing with. But essentially the long and short of it was, not unlike the younger son, I just said, you know what, just cut me a check. Like, if there's anything coming to me, whatever that means, like, I'm done. Because I could not reconcile the idea of a God that was both all loving and all powerful. And that wasn't even just confined to my own, like, how did you let this happen? Although that was part of it. It was actually tasting real tragedy for the first time, and, like, experiencing and tasting real death, and then realizing that that's what people experience all the time. Like, that is our world. And so I just couldn't reconcile that.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, rather than struggle through that, I just kind of walked away.
Well, and back to kind of what we talked about before, like your kind of formation history in a lot of ways, we've identified that there's not a robust theology of suffering. And so I'm kind of curious, your experience so the church didn't seem your spiritual background didn't provide you with the spiritual resources or framework to be able to process in a healthy way a lot of the trauma that you experienced and this utterly disorienting season of life. And so you mentioned, okay, and you try to turn to spiritual community in almost like a muscle memory sense, and find that lacking. You don't find the resources there to help you on your healing journey. So you leave that behind. So that's just, you turn your back on, was it practicing, believing? Like, what does that look like for you? That season of, would you use the term deconstruction, or is it just kind of an embittered turn your back?
What is it when you light it on fire?
Immolation.
Thank you. I think it was probably more that, like where, like I didn't really, I can't say like, oh yes, this was the point. Like I examined all the theological facts. It was just a pure response to pain and sleeplessness and stress and poor nutrition. Like that's the thing too. It's just like, it's all these other secondary and all these other third order effects where like, like all of those things are going to be like hard on your mental health. It's going to be hard on your well-being. But at the core of that was like this wound that was festering, and I didn't know what to do about that. And so, like it felt very much like when I would pray, it just felt nothing. And so then I just stopped. And I guess that's a broader conversation of what constitutes prayer, because I do believe that even the handful of times where like I had the audacity to curse God, I believe that was received in its own way as prayer. Yeah. I don't believe the Lord was afraid of that. I'm not proud of that. And I would hope to, if faced with, another tragedy of that sort, I would hope for my own well-being. Like that's the thing. It's like the path that I chose in terms of walking away. It was easier in some ways because I didn't have to resolve this tension. It was just like, fine, God is whatever he is. And so he's not there. But then that just makes it harder in so many other ways. And so, it doesn't really solve anything. You just choose a different path. And you're still faced with the same existential questions. You're still faced with, why am I here? What am I doing? What is my identity? All those things don't go away. You've just removed the being who can be most helpful in answering those questions. And so that was, spiritual practice just pretty much just went away.
Gotcha. So the younger son has a quote unquote come to Jesus moment. A rock bottom moment where he's sitting there with the pigs and wants to, fill his belly with that slop, and is like, wait a second, so was there a wake up moment for you? Yeah.
I mean, there was a few, like there was a number of like turning points, but for me, like Brooke and I had gotten, we actually separated and divorced at a point because I wasn't violent or anything, but I was just an emotional shell. I was successful at work, and I was just a shell of a human being, and she didn't want to be married to that, and I didn't blame her. And I wasn't acknowledging and didn't really have a container to acknowledge, honestly, what is post-traumatic stress? I know what that means, and what's the path for, is this something that you just live with, or is this, so I just disengaged from it. So, I mean, the Lord had brought us back together. But
how long were you guys separated?
A year.
Okay.
Yeah. 2009, 2010.
And what were you doing for work that you were succeeding in?
I was a financial advisor.
Okay.
So I was a money manager.
From military to money.
Military to money. So it's the next book.
It's the next book. Two powerful forces that make the world go round in lots of different ways.
Yeah. And that was part of my medication, was trying to medicate with success.
Yeah.
Was like, I felt like an epic failure from the military, so I felt like if I could achieve outside of that in the civilian world, that would help, and it didn't. I mean, it didn't.
Yeah.
So, so I guess probably the most, like, I had to get to a place, there was points where, during the season where we were separated, that's when I started kind of like letting the Lord back into my life, and like, asking for help in that way and engaging that relationship. But for a number of years, I still like sleep was a real problem, nightmares were a real problem, like a lot of stuff was a real problem, and I didn't really know how to fix that. And so my mental health, emotional health was just kind of slowly deteriorating until you're kind of like, I was at the point where, you know, you're pulling the pistol out of your gun safe and you're putting the mag in and taking it out. And it wasn't because like I didn't have something to live for. It was because I was just really tired.
Yeah.
And it's like, if this is what, like, I'm not very old, and if this is what I'm going to have to live with, I just don't know if I can do that. And so it was during that season that, so that was the very kind of darkest hour where I was kind of just, you know, head barely above water, and not very good at asking for help. Like that was really kind of the underlying issue was my own pride, was not wanting to invite other people into the conversation and the brokenness. In part, I didn't know how, and in part, I didn't want to appear weak. And it was at that time that a friend of mine invited me to a retreat. And the retreat was not one that I would normally have ever attended because it was an ayahuasca retreat. And so, but he had gone to this place and he described it, and he described to me kind of what his experience was like. And it was just in my spirit. I was just like, yeah, I need to go to that. And so I go to him to this place for 2 nights. And that's a whole nother conversation.
Yeah.
But,
Jeez. Hold on. Let me check off ayahuasca on my bingo card.
But I was, I went into that very broken, very hopeless. Basically like, yeah, I'll try. You have like a psychedelic from South America I've never heard of. Sure. Yeah. Where do I show up? But I remember like that first night in this ceremony, that it's ceremonial. It's not like a drug party or something. It's not like that at all. But it's also not anything associated with the Christian tradition that I was part of. And I remember sitting there in this very, very nice place, and I had just drank the ayahuasca, the stuff that you take, and just this feeling of just dread washed over me, and I was just like this fear, this panic, like this is not. Like I've just invited demons into my life. Like what is going to happen? Like this is not a good, like just like, and then it was really interesting. Like what started to happen for me anyway, it was like the realization of like, I'm basically judging this whole experience and judging all these other people because it doesn't meet my criteria of what I think healing should look like. Yeah. And slowly it was just sort of like the Holy Spirit was just very gracious. It was just like, you're the problem. Like the darkness right now, it's you. Like it's your ego, it's your fear, and you can let that go. And so that experience was that's where I experienced healing for post-traumatic stress. And there's no magic to ayahuasca. That was the modality that the Lord used to heal me. Somebody could have spit in the mud and rubbed it on me, and if that's what needed to happen, that's what would have happened. But it was a beautiful modality because it completely challenged. It required me to be absolutely surrendered to something I was so uncomfortable with. That was not part of my faith tradition. And that is what I think allowed the Lord to get to the core of the issue for me, which was my pride. And that was the sickness that was keeping me sick. Yeah. And so that from that point, there's been continued to experience healing in different ways, but that was a significant turning point in terms of not having post-traumatic stress and kind of opening a new chapter in life.
That's fascinating. I didn't actually, I had no idea that was part of your story. Yeah. I'm so glad though that you experienced healing. Yeah. And that you sensed the tenderness of God being present there, and that was kind in revealing your part in the suffering that you're experiencing. But it's hard for me to hear some of that without yeah, once again, like just through the lens of all the things that had formed you up until that point, when we don't, like when we, I think this is a great segue into this conversation about, the healing power of story and why it is that we here at Nations try and do a good job of being faithful to the brokenness of the world while we're also always looking for hope and the surprising places that God is moving and working. It's because it's exactly stories like yours where, hey, we didn't expect for God to show up in that way, and didn't expect an experience like that to lead to you reclaiming in a lot of ways and rediscovering your faith in Christ and a new trajectory for your own life. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about what happens after this. You are able to experience some measure of peace and healing, and obviously you reunite with Brooke, and then you continue being finance guy for a bit. Yeah. So, what did your healing journey look like after that?
After that, it was a lot more like, Brooke articulates this a lot better than I can. The short version of it was, it was almost as if, she intuitively knew without thinking about it that she kind of had to hold it together more because I was not okay. And then once like I had this experience and all of a sudden it's like, there was still like kind of getting used to like, it's like you'd been in a wheelchair and all of a sudden you can stand up and walk. Like, I don't even know how to describe it as far as just like you're spiritually like awake again. And this, the sickness that you've been carrying, it was just kind of like just carved out of you. And then having experienced that, it was almost as if without there being, I don't think, a conscious thought to it, it was like then she had to let go of a lot of things, not against me, but just in terms of like her own, I think there's a realization of her own like wounding and brokenness just from like me, not trying to hurt her, but you can't, anybody who, if you're telling yourself that, well, I'm not sharing my trauma with those closest to me, like we don't talk about it, therefore, it's not, I'm keeping it, I'm saving them from it. It's like, if you are in relationship with them, that's non-negotiable. Like, like maybe you're not talking with them about, your nightmares all the time, which is probably good, but don't fool yourself into thinking that your woundedness doesn't impact and alter the story of those that are closest to you, because mine very much did. Yeah. And so there was a season, and that continues, in just marriage in general. You have two sinners that come together and pledge themselves to one another, and which is absurd. And wonderful.
Recipe for a beautiful disaster.
Right. And so like that's God's chief mechanism of sanctification in us, is essentially if we're married, it's our spouse. And that's not very comfortable, and that can be really painful and difficult at times. And so there was a lot of things that I had to repent of, and just really recalibrate. And I'm still doing that. I'm still learning. And so there was that season, and then moving into, I guess, the telling of, some aspect of what I and our family experienced, which was not something that I ever really expected to do. But then that became, there was an invitation to do that, and it was at the right time and with the right people, and that continuing sort of on this journey of telling story that is dark, is seemingly hopeless, is still in many respects unresolved. There's not a happy ending to this story necessarily. The people that were hurt and killed are still dead, right? Yeah. There's that element of it, but seeing also the power of, in the right way and with the right help, just the power of telling a story and allowing others to connect with that. It's been a real, I don't know if joy is the right word, but it definitely has been a real grace that that we've experienced that
Yeah.
we're really grateful for.
Yeah, it's so strange how we fear the broken and the painful parts of our stories, the parts that tempt us towards shame and towards isolation. We're so fearful of those, and for good reason. They're painful and they're messy, and oftentimes, they run counter to the image that we like to project of success or power or likability or whatever normalcy. But when we befriend that part of ourselves, when we get to have an experience like you did, where you encounter God's love that reveals to you, hey, you're trapped in a prison of your own pride, and that is compounding a suffering that I don't desire for you.
Yeah.
So if you're able to accept a new gift, one of humility, then you can begin to experience not only healing, but your own healing can become a blessing to other people. And that is just one of the coolest, paradoxes that I have yet to encounter.
Yeah. And I experienced the neat thing too is when I can look back, even the stories that were shared with me from other people were also part of that journey, right? It's this ecosystem of story where, my grandfather just I want to go, fight and serve my country like he did. Part of his caring for me in the aftermath of what I experienced was he was an artilleryman in Italy for a year and a half, and him opening up to me about friendly fire that he was responsible for.
Oh, wow.
And so there's, and others, who all of a sudden, and it wasn't, the cool thing about that is it's not just this one-sided transaction. He feels less alone sharing something with his grandson who now actually has some context for understanding this terrible thing. And then I feel more known and actually closer to him in that regard. This thing that could otherwise be bound in, I think one of the greatest lies, which is shame, which is guilt, which is isolation. If people really knew who you were and what you did, you would not be loved. And again, there's time and place, but when that can get broken through, it does the exact opposite. It actually can create connection and it can create healing. And it's just getting past that initial bridge of fear.
Yeah, which is, that's why in part I'm so thrilled about the work that we get to do, is because we're taking the lessons and the truth and the wisdom that you just have shared here through your own story and trying to scale that and trying to find these stories of brokenness and of beauty throughout the world and hold them up so that people are invited into community. I mean, in some ways it's the community of the suffering. But it's also that seeing that transform into a community of hope is, I think, precisely what we need. So what is it that you're most excited for, or what do you have hopes and dreams for the path forward from this point on for you, or for Nations?
Very excited about Nations and very excited about what's developing here and just the creative team that's been curated and is also forming. And so I feel very honored to be part of that. I think that there's good news, bad news. There's a lot of brokenness in the world. I don't know that there's more brokenness in the world, but we're certainly more aware of or have the opportunity to connect with that brokenness in very all-encompassing and visceral ways, just with the way that information travels now, right? If I want to almost live stream aspects of a war on the other side of the world, I can do that. Yeah. And that's crazy. And so I think it's a lot for the human race to sort of grapple with as far as, compassion fatigue. What do I engage with? What do I not engage with? The world feels like a crazy place. What role do I have to play in that in the midst of just trying to pay rent or just trying to make it month to month? And so I think broadly speaking, the thing that I think I'm most excited about is just trying to be part of calling out people to participate in the story of like their own brokenness and then what the Lord wants to do with that and what the Lord is doing with that. What I experienced is not unique. Thankfully so. Trauma is not confined to people who served in the military. It takes many, many forms, and a lot of the same markers that made my journey harder on myself and on my family are the same things for people. And so I'm really hopeful and praying that we have the courage to follow into those dark places, and that we have the grace and strength to care for those stories, because that's the other thing that I learned when I look back. Whether it was amazing how the Lord used journalists. If it wasn't for a producer and a writer at ESPN, I never would have told this story. And they midwifed this story so well in retrospect. And so I think that I think that's part of the role we get to play without owning an outcome. That's not our job. But inviting people into the truth that, the cliche, find your greatest pain, find your greatest purpose. I think there's some truth to that. Yeah. And so I think inviting people into that, from where they're at, whether it's, brokenness and trauma from all manner of things, especially with the church, in some cases, that's okay. And it's okay to name that. And it's okay to feel things that don't feel good, and process that and step away if you need to. And the only thing I would say in the midst of that is, as best as you can, like, have some community around you as you're doing that.
Absolutely.
The biggest regret that I have was not that I hated God for a season. I do lament that, because I can't even, that's not a, something I would say lightly, but from a relational standpoint, there were people in my life who didn't know what I was going through, who I damaged relationship because I didn't invite them into the honor of sitting with me at a hard time. You know what I mean?
I do, yeah.
And I think sometimes we kid ourselves and say, well, this person is busy, or they're overwhelmed, or they're whatever. And it's just like, invite people in, pray for discernment in terms of who those people are, but don't struggle with that alone. Yeah. And so that would be a word of encouragement to people as they're wrestling with some of those things. But yeah, I'm excited about that for Nations. And there is, like, within the realm of, veterans advocacy, we're involved to some degree in trying to help move the needle with respect to how the unseen wounds of war are viewed and treated. So right now it's depending on the statistics, it's north of 20 veterans a day take their life by suicide. If you count drug overdoses, which the VA doesn't, that number is 2x that on a daily basis. And that epidemic is not the epidemic of hopelessness is not confined to the veteran community. Yeah. So there has to be a narrative shift, and there has to be a cultural shift with respect to how we view that. And there has to be a spiritual shift and an invitation for the maker and healer of all things to be part of that too. And so to whatever degree, like, our experience can be put in service of that, we're very much open to it, knowing that there's a lot of people that need to be involved in shaping that new reality.
Well, to the degree to which that you've done that today, I am grateful, my friend. And it's a privilege to get to know you and to get to work alongside you here at Nations. And I'm grateful for you taking the time to sit down and share a little bit of a window into your story and some of the hard-won wisdom that you've walked away with. I pray that the healing only deepens, and that you guys have more opportunities to share your story and just what it is that God's done and is doing in and through you guys. So thanks.
Yeah. Thank you.
Nailed it. 35 minutes.
Really?
No.
I was going to say, that can't be that fast.